regulations and risk management in financial systems. Plan of this lecture. First, we are going to introduce the concept of value at risk, VAR, in risk management. Second, we are going to use an example to explain how value at risk is used to enhance return on capital for financial institutions. Third, we are going to explain how credit default swaps are used to implement risk management strategies. Finally, we are going to discuss theory of regulation. Return on asset in financial institutions. Banking operations are mostly loans of various types. Loans are simple businesses. The return on assets in financial institutions are generally pretty low, around 2%. To earn high return on equity, massive leverages are required. This makes financial institutions vulnerable to downside risks. Because of high leverage, risk management is essential for long-term profitability of banks. At branch level, it is the management of individual loans and other assets. Now we will discuss risk management at whole institutions. Complexity and risk management. With the increase of size and scope of financial institutions, it becomes more and more difficult for top managers to understand the details of all the operations. They hope to depend on some summary figures to measure the whole risk of the entire companies. VAR, value at risk. Value at risk was first developed in JP Morgan. It attempts to give a simple and quantitative measure of risk at all levels in an institution. Definition of value at risk of a portfolio. It is the threshold value that the loss on the portfolio over a given time horizon exceeds this value in the given probability level. For example, if a portfolio asset has a 1 year, 5% value at risk of $100 million, there is a 5% probability that portfolio will fall in value by more than 100 million over 1 year period. Advantages and disadvantages of VAR. Advantages: quantitative approach. It is simple to understand. It can be applied to all levels of an institution. It can be applied to all types of businesses. Disadvantages. This is what we are going to discuss in this talk. We need to emphasize that the purpose of any business practice, including risk management, is not to manage risk itself, but to earn a high rate of return. In other words, we manage risk to make money, not to reduce risk. Example 1. Using value at risk in risk management. A bank has $100 million capital. On average, bank asset will have 80% probability to generate a return of 12.5 and 20% probability to generate a return of negative 40% over 1 year period. What is the return on asset of the bank? What is the 1 year 5% value at risk of $1 million asset? If the regular system requires 1 year 5% VAR to be equal or less than a bank's capital, how much asset can the bank hold? What is the return on capital with this level of assets? What is the largest amount of loss the bank will incur with this level of asset? Solution 1. The return on asset is 0.125 times 80% probability plus negative 0.4 times 20% probability. This is equal to 0.02 or 2%. So the return on asset is 2%. This is typical for banking asset. 2. At 5% level, the bank could lose 0.4 million on $1 million asset. So value at risk of $1 million asset is 0.4 million. 3. The bank's capital is 100 million. For every $1 million asset, its value at risk is 0.4 million. The amount of asset the bank can carry is therefore 100 million divided by 0.4 is equal to $250 million. 4. The return on capital is return on asset times leverage. This is equal to 2% times 250 divided by 100. It is equal to 5%. 5. The largest amount of possible loss is the largest amount of loss per $1 million asset times total asset. It is equal to 0.4 times 250 equal to $100 million. Comments. The largest amount of loss is equal to the amount of capital. There is no need for government bailout. However, return on capital at 5% is not very satisfactory for many. Example 2, continued from example 1. There are two banks with identical capital and earning structures, as described in the last example. Suppose the earnings of the two banks are independent. Two banks sign an agreement. In a particular year, if one bank earns positive return and another bank makes a loss, the two banks will equalize their earnings. With this agreement, what is the 1 year 5% value at risk $1 million asset for each bank. If the regulatory system requires 1 year 5% VAR to be equal or less than a bank's capital, how much asset can each bank take? What is the return on capital with this level of asset? What is the largest amount of loss each bank can incur with this level of asset? Solution 1. The earnings of these two banks are independent. There are 3 scenarios of their earning combinations. Scenario 1. Both banks have positive returns in the same year. The probability of such scenario is 80% times 80% equal to 64%. Scenario 2. One bank has positive earning and the other bank has negative earning in the same year. The probability of this scenario is 2 times 80% times 20% equal to 32%. Scenario 3. Both banks have negative returns in the same year. The probability of this scenario is 20% times 20% equal to 4%. From the agreement between two banks, when the return of one bank is positive and the other is negative, two banks will equalize their earnings. As a result, the earnings of both banks will be 0.15 minus 0.4 divided by 2, which equal to negative 13.75%. The probability of scenario 3 is 4%. The cutoff of 5% VAR is at scenario 2, whose return is equal to negative 0.1375. 5% VAR for $1 million asset for both banks is $0.1375 million. 2. Each bank has 100 million capital. The amount of asset each bank can carry is 100 million divided by 0.1375. This is equal to $727.27 million. 3. The return on capital is 2% times the leverage. The leverage is 727.27 divided by 100. The result is equal to 0.145 or 14.5%. 4. The largest amount of possible loss is 0.4 times the amount of asset. This is 727.27. It is equal to $290.91 million. Comments. With the agreement of two banks, the return on capital is 14.5%. This is much higher than 5% without agreement. At the same time, the largest amount of possible loss is $290.91 million. This is also much higher than 100 million without agreement. In particular, the loss is higher than the bank's capital. This makes government bailout necessary to save the bank. The probability of such bailout is 4% per year or once every 25 years. Example 3. Further refinement. Two banks have identical capital and earning structures, as described in the last exercise. Suppose earnings of the two banks are independent. Two banks sign an agreement. In a particular year, if both banks earn positive return, they will set aside half of their earning as a reserve to be distributed in years when one bank earns positive return and another bank makes a loss. If one bank earns positive return and another bank makes a loss, the two banks will equalize their earnings. With this agreement, what is the 1-year 5% value at risk of $1 million asset for each bank? If the regulatory system requires 1-year 5% value at risk to be equal to or less than a bank's capital, how much asset can each bank hold? What is the return on capital with this level of asset? What is the largest amount of loss each bank will incur with this level of asset? Solution 1. When both banks make positive earnings, they will leave half of their earnings as a reserve. The amount of this reserve is 0.125 divided by 2. This is 0.0625 or 6.25%. The probability of making such a reserve is 64%, as calculated in the last example. When one bank makes positive earning and the other bank makes negative earning, each bank will have an earning of, after equalization, negative 0.1375 from calculation from last example. The probability of such scenario is 32%. Adding the reserve money from good years, the amount of earning is negative 0.1375 plus 0.0625 times 64% divided by 32%. It is equal to negative 0.0125. So 5% VAR for $1 million asset in both banks is $0.0125 million. 2. The amount of asset each bank can carry is 100 million divided by 0.0125 is equal to $8,000 million. 3. Return on capital is 2% times 8,000 divided by 100 equal to 1.6 or 160%. 4. The largest amount of possible loss is 0.4 times 8,000 equal to $3,200 million. Comment: with further refinement of agreement, the return on capital can reach an extraordinary 160%. At the same time, the largest amount of possible loss becomes $3,200 million, far higher than the $100 million bank capital. The improvement of risk management practice greatly improved the return on capital for bank owners. At the same time, the society has to bear much greater burden from possible bank losses. Some implications: banks can hold more assets with improved risk management practices. In other words, banks can be more leveraged with better risk management practices. Financial institutions also securitize assets on a massive scale. This increases the demand for financial assets. In turn, it drives the production of real assets. This is behind the housing boom and high-tech boom. Some examples can be seen in the movie and book The Big Short. The banks are hungry for more mortgages. The demand for financial assets and financiable assets squeeze the basic activities such as raising children in families. Mortgage-backed securities. Mortgage-backed securities and other asset securitizations are important innovations that reduce the amount of assets on banks' books. They increase banks' business and reduce leverage. Those buying the mortgage-backed securities are often foreigners. They don't have the same level of intimate knowledge when the mortgage stays with the local originators. The originators of the mortgages also have less incentive to do due diligence. This is a graph of assets of Canadian banks from 1990 to 2017. You can see the amount of assets increased substantially over this period of time. Change of banking assets in Canada. In 1990, the amount of assets in Canadian banks is $376 billion. At 2017, the amount is $2.8 trillion.